Audiobook Masters, listen to your imagination.
Living, Loving, and Lying Awake at Night. Written by Sindiwe Magona. Narrated by Mandisa Yoyo. Part 1. Women at Work. Leaving. It was right at the time of night when dreams glue eyelids tight and spirits, good and evil, ride the air. When lovers stir, the fire spent once more rekindled, and the souls of the chosen sigh as they leave the flesh, homeward bound. A woman lay, wide-eyed, on her grass mat on the floor of a tiny, round mud hut. She was tired, spent, body and mind. The tiredness of her mind and body and heart came together as one. It robbed her of sleep. It forced her to relive the day just past, the day she feared and knew she never wanted to see again. But fight against it as she did, the day kept painting itself into her mind's eye. Over and over and over, it kept pulling her back to itself and away from sleep and forgetfulness. Eyelids sealed, she saw it all. Trapped. Unless, as always, yesterday she had been up with the first bird's song. Long before morning broke, her day had started. She had crept away from her mat, not to wake the baby still sleeping. Fearful, she went to the cardboard box where she kept food. Enough mealie meal for today's morning porridge. If she made it really thin, used as little mealie meal as possible, she could save some for the next day. Perhaps. But maybe it would not be enough even so. Getting up, she had not put the baby to the breast. That was drying up. Better to spread it over the day. Taking kindle, she went outside and started a fire. Wood from the faggot next to the hut was her fuel. By the time the children woke, the three-legged pot was boiling steadily away, and the morning's nourishment was readying. Soon the children, content, were happily at play, or, those old enough, doing their little chores. The woman had fed the baby, put her on her back, and then had gathered cow dung from the nearby veld where the cattle grazed. On her bared knees, skirt girded high, the basin of cow dung next to her, she set to work. A scoop or two from the basin, thwacks, thwacks onto the floor. Left hand steadying her, the right, like a knife spreads peanut butter on a slice of bread or a builder's spatula, cement on a brick, slowly and evenly, swept the dung across the floor. Long whirls painted by her hand, painted wet green, the color of fresh cow dung. One bit of floor at a time until the whole floor was smeared. She spread her love through her fingers, dung and water and her tears mingling in her offering, seeping through her fingers as it spread, sending its scent up her nostrils. Then she went to the river. The pail swinging at her side sang its song of emptiness, the wind playing in its dry throat. Returning, it stood silent on her head, filled with life from the river. It was content, and thus made no noise. Neither did the baby asleep on the woman's back. She had been fed and knew nothing of her mother's anxiety that her breasts were drying. The mother feared for her little one's life. 2 cups of mealie meal, 2 breasts that were drying up, an old hen that had stopped laying eggs, an empty kraal from which she could no longer find even dry cow dung to use in making a fire. So long had it held no cattle, and 5 children who daily needed feeding. These were the thoughts that traveled with the woman on her way to and from the river, and stayed with her the whole day through. Now, as she lay awake, these same thoughts stole her sleep, stole her forgetfulness, robbed her of what little peace should have been hers in the middle of the night. Gather berries from the forest, but autumn is a stingy season. pluck umfino, wild spinach, from the veld if sheep and goats had overlooked any. Dig the same veld for roots, if you can beat the witch doctor to it. She had spent the day thinking of ways out of her quandary. Now, in the middle of the night, the bothersome problem refused to surrender her to sleep and rest. Weak, etiolated light flickered ineffectually at the far end of the room. On the naked floor that gleamed from the smearing of that day stood an old small tin that once, long ago, had contained jam or condensed milk or some other such. Through a hole in its lid, a dirty paraffin-sodded rag sprouted. And it was from this contraption that a frail light made its valiant but vain attempt at splintering the dense dark of the room. The woman, who wasn't quite 30 yet, slept in this little hut with her 5 children. She had been made a wife at a tender age, for that was the thing to do in those days. And each time her husband returned from the gold mines of Johannesburg, where he worked for 11 months a year, she was soon with child. Had all her pregnancies come to fruition, and had none of her babies died in infancy, there would have been perhaps more than double that number. This moonless night, her mind kept turning and turning, asking itself questions the owner had never heard asked of anyone before. Questions that both frightened her and left her feeling light as the down of a new-hatched chick. If I leave, thought the woman, who will look after my children? Who will cook for them? And if one should be sick, what will happen? Before the answer came to her, other questions thrust themselves into her mind, burning it with their urgency. If I stay here with them, what shall we eat? If one of them should take sick, what shall I do? What is to become of us if I do not go? Her husband was not one to remember his wife once he was in the gold mines of Johannesburg. As years went by, the woman had come to realize this about him, and although she loved him, still, she had slowly come to accept that, unlike husbands of most women in the village, her husband would never be a provider. Not to her, not to his children. He didn't even give his mother support. And that was, indeed, something, for in his own fashion, he loved his mother greatly. Some would say, inordinately so, in fact. That night, the mind of the woman told her, you only have a husband when his body can lie next to yours and his stick pushes up your thighs. We have all these children, said the woman to herself, one for each time he has come back from the mines. But even that doesn't give my husband a heart. As soon as he leaves, he forgets all about us. In the barely lit room, the mother could discern darker shapes on the floor. Her sleeping children, oblivious to the battle raging in her mind, in her heart. Somewhere in the middle of the room, she heard a moan and knew it was Sizwe, the one after whom the baby came. How she could tell them apart, not just their faces, but even their coughs, their laughs, and the way each turned himself or herself at night on their little grass mats. But then, she thought, if I couldn't do that, I would not be a mother. If I couldn't do that, I would not be a mother. I would not be a mother. If I could not do that. That's it, screamed her brain, alerted to possibility. That's it. That is it. It said it as if it had stumbled on a golden nugget or a cool pool of sweet, clear water in the middle of a vast desert. A find. Salvation. Her heart leapt. She had found the key. I will not be a mother that way. She would fulfill her obligations as she understood them and provide for them. The only way she could be a mother to her children, she saw, would be to leave them. With the stealth of a cat about to mess, she moved. she did not want to waken any of them. With a pang, she thought of Nomakwezi, her eldest, who slept like a hen, one eye open, foot ready to leap to wakefulness. Nomakwezi was the most likely to awaken if her movements were but a little louder than those of a mouse. She had got under her thin blanket, fully clothed. Now, hands slid beneath the flannel petticoat she wore and reached up to her waist. There it was, confirmed her touch. Fingers rubbed, closing around the lump in the crude money belt made from a strip from an old pinafore. There it was. She could. She rose and stood still and straight as a reed on her mat while her thoughts galloped away. Pulling her blanket around her, she walked towards the door, slowly, carefully, and with a heavy heart. She opened the door and stepped out. Sheathed from head to ankle, face and feet met the chill of night as she softly closed the door behind her. For a brief moment, she stood outside the door, stood still, and listened to the breathing of her children. Her children, breathing in deepest sleep. The woman listened and imagined she heard, psh, psh, and could almost see the rise and fall of the baby's heaving form, asleep and trusting. A thorn, long embedded in her heart, twisted itself. Tss. A drop of blood squeezed out of her heart, and it lit the whole night-blackened sky. The stars showered light, making her path as bright could be. Tss. Clear as spring water beneath mountain boulders, she saw her way. Tss. That was the spur. Tss. 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 Light as dandelion seed, adrift in April's breeze, she walked away from the hut where her children slept. Away she sped, swiftly, before the thorn-drawn drop of blood dried, giving her a chicken's fearful heart. Before she remembered that Sindiwe, the 6-month-old baby, would burst her lungs before cockcrow, reaching for the breast that would not be there. That would come before the older children started to cry, "Uphi umama? Uphi umama? Umama uyephi?" Where is mother? Where is mother? Where has mother gone? That would bring Manala, their grandmother, to the hut. Manala, who had never forgiven her for being the woman in whom her son found the honey of the deep of night, woman's sweetness. Manala would take care of the children, the woman consoled herself. After all, they are her son's children. Even though she doesn't like me, said the woman to herself, she will have to look after them. Her heart began to bleed, but the thorn saved her that pain. Tss, she remembered. I would not be a mother if I didn't do this. Past the kraal, where a lone ram lay chewing cud, past the wide-open gate that had not been closed, even when as a Makoti, a new wife, she had been carried into this home all those years ago. Down the lane winding towards the river, and past the brooding fields where maize stalks tall as a child of 10 stood still in the airless night, and she had left her home. Anyone who saw her now would know she was up to no good. She was a witch about her witchery, some would say. Others would call her a wanton, a slut who could not wait for her husband's return and had been spied on her way to meet her illicit lover. The more imaginative would surely give him substance, not a name, but a more tantalizing form. Vague illusions are stronger than outright lies. No one can actually disprove them. And if you would put a stamp of authenticity on their tale by having seen, with their own eyes, this wicked woman locked in indelicate embrace with I can't name names, Whites put you in jail for that sort of thing. In the end, she knew they would say she ran away to hide a pregnancy that began too many moons after her husband had left. Her innocent mission, born of desperation, would give rise to tales she was glad she would not be there to hear. Tsp. Her children hungered daily. Tsp. Her husband was a dog that unsheathes itself onto a tuft of grass. He forgot the grass he'd peed on, forgot what came from that. Tsp. Tsp. Away the woman flew on her feet that hardly touched the ground, her blanket rolled and girded around her waist. Down towards the river, she took the steep slope of the knoll, avoiding the gentler path. She did not feel her knees protest at the abuse as her calloused feet ground clods, ignored pebbles, and rebuffed the razor-sharp stones. Alongside the river she hurried, her step as swift as its flow. The swish, swish of the water surged through her veins. A night bird took umbrage at her invasion and with piercing cry flapped and winged away. She reached the shallows with the fierce dark that precedes dawn. She spread her blanket, took off all her clothes, and rolled them in the blanket into a careful bundle, and onto her head it went. One hand holding her firm possessions, the other steadying her. Slowly she waded across the cold, swirling water. The tide strong, she firmed her legs as she straddled those whirling, sucking gushes. Her progress slowed by the need to fight the downdrift. At last, she had gained the other bank. Too wrapped in the heat the drop of blood gave her body, urging her on and on. Not once had she thought of witches. As she fought to ford the river, she paused to scan the horizon. She'd get real rest on the train. There was a field to cross, half-grown with mealie meal stalks. She plowed through. Angry red blotches splashed the far sky as she came to the foot of the brooding high mountain. Up, she looked, high up, to where the peak reached up and kissed the red-tinged sky. Soon, she was lost in the black thick of tree, shrub, and undergrowth. The taste of the long trek dried her throat. Tsp. The hunger she'd left behind spurred her flagging feet. She could smell it, the hunger gnawing at her children, gnawing at her heart. A dense stank plugged her nostrils, warm, wet, dying foliage giving birth to new soil. The mountain pressed against her face, blacking all. She was as good as blind. The flurry of an upset nest gave her a start, but she did not stop. Then a large-sounding toad croaked, calling forth an eager, perky response from an attentive mate. Here and there, as the woman plodded on, things of the mountain night skulked away from the dawn. Red softened to orange gold and some soft touches of pink. Birds chirruped, hidden in bushes, and the night owl hooted, swishing low, slow wings towards his rest. The woman trudged on, her nipples hardened from the milk, wanting and waiting. She felt as if they belonged to another, as if she no longer knew why they burned. In a gorge near the top, she stumbled on a baboon dreaming away. Startled, he coughed his irritation as he lunged clumsily into the denser blackness. Imperceptibly, the air thinned, the mustiness fell from her nostrils. She crested the height. Like an invading warrior, she surveyed the terrain, bathed in soft hues of pink, even then paling to whitish pink, turning to the hot white of an impatient sun. Umtata lay bare and silent. Not a soul stirred in welcome or rejection. Briefly, she wondered whether any of her children had awakened. Was the baby, even then, crying for her feed? Was her mother-in-law already in the house with her children? Would she look after them, or... Her thoughts refused to go any further. Instead, the thorn reminded her why she was doing what she was doing. If I don't, I would not be a mother. Tssp. The woman was ice cold, drenched in sweat as she stood there drinking in the sprawl of the sleeping town at her feet. Kneeling, she took out first the one, then the other breast. Plumped hard and veined, they were hot to her crying hand. Squirt, squirt. Jets of white streamed to foam the ground. Squirt, squirt. The greedy soil quenched its thirst with her baby's life, while near her knees the woman's eyes wet a spot. Relieved, she put her breasts back beneath her tattered dress. One last look. The road was clear. One last sigh for the children who sent her away, whose hunger drove her through the night, river, field, forest, and mountain. How she loved them.